The crisp paper of a single-dollar bill slid across the mahogany table, stopping right in front of my hands. I looked up to see my mother smirk, an expression of pure satisfaction dancing across her face as she murmured that some children simply do not measure up to expectations. Beside her, my father didn't even blink, his voice cold and detached as he told me to go out and finally earn my own way in life. They had just handed my sister a check large enough to purchase a literal estate, leaving me with nothing but a mocking piece of paper and a sealed envelope from my late grandfather. Growing up in our household meant learning how to navigate a very specific, suffocating kind of silence. By the time I turned 8, I had already mastered the art of being entirely invisible, realizing that my family did not fail to see me, but rather chose to actively ignore my existence. I distinctly remember a chilly autumn afternoon when my mother carefully polished my sister's numerous debate medals and piano trophies, proudly displaying them on the living room mantel for everyone to admire. My own modest blue ribbon from the county science fair was left crumpled on a side table, completely forgotten until it eventually vanished into the trash. My father always reinforced this dynamic, constantly praising my sister for her grand academic achievements while treating me more like an unpaid property manager than a daughter. He would casually assign me the chores no one else wanted to touch, like scrubbing the yard or walking the dog, while dismissing my steady nature as a mere consolation prize. The only human being who ever truly looked at me and saw a person was my grandfather, Arthur, a patient man whose quiet voice always made me feel like my thoughts actually mattered. He would take me out to his isolated lake house on the weekends, away from the suffocating pressure of my parents. Those peaceful afternoons on the wooden dock, surrounded by the scent of aged cedar and the gentle rhythm of lapping water, became my absolute sanctuary. Arthur kept 2 old fishing rods in his shed, and he would always hand me the one etched with his own initials, advising me to look past the surface of things to see what was pulling underneath. He never forced me to speak, understanding intuitively that my quietness was not a weakness, but a way of absorbing the world around me. As we watched the birds ruffle their feathers against the breeze, he taught me how to notice the tiny details that everyone else missed. The stark contrast between my grandfather's world and my parents' home became painfully undeniable during a winter holiday party they threw for my sister's latest accolade. As I spent the evening carrying heavy coats to the back bedroom, I overheard my mother laughing softly with a guest near the dining room, casually remarking that I was perfectly fine because I never needed much of anything. That single sentence burned itself into my memory, revealing the harsh truth that in our family, expressing no needs was translated as deserving absolutely nothing. The very next morning, I fled back to the lake house, seeking comfort in the honest chill of the water. The morning following the reading of the will, the atmosphere inside the lake house felt incredibly tense and commercialized. My parents were already pacing through the rooms like cold real estate appraisers, opening drawers and cataloging antique furniture as if grief were just another financial transaction to be managed. My sister hovered near the window with a coffee mug, offering hollow condolences that somehow managed to center entirely around her own discomfort rather than the loss of our grandfather. My father then dumped a massive stack of legal folders onto the main table, entirely bypassing my presence as he announced that my sister would handle everything. When my mother reached the tiny pile of items left specifically for me, her eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of the single dollar, the key, and the thick envelope. The silence in the room grew heavy and suffocating before she repeated her favorite phrase, telling me to go earn my own living without a single shred of hesitation in her voice. My sister uncomfortably shifted her weight, and my father suddenly became intensely interested in a random document, completely refusing to meet my gaze. In that exact moment, I realized they weren't just neglecting me anymore, they were trying to completely erase my existence from the family history. Instead of arguing or giving them the satisfaction of tears, I quietly grabbed my envelope and slipped out the back door without saying a single word of farewell. The sharp winter air hit my face as I walked to my car, providing a strange sense of clarity that instantly quieted the echoing insults of my parents. I drove straight toward a secluded historic inn near the mountain ridge, checking into a small corner room managed by a kind woman named Clara who knew my grandfather well. Safe within those 4 quiet walls, I finally broke the wax seal on the envelope to find a key, a list of complex numbers, and a single note. My grandfather's distinctive handwriting instructed me to begin looking exactly where the truth had first been bent by the people I trusted most. I spent hours staring at the mysterious columns of figures, copying them into my notebook and analyzing them against every financial pattern I could possibly think of. Suddenly, the chaotic data aligned perfectly, exposing a massive trail of hidden payments and artificially inflated corporate valuations that only made sense if someone was actively hiding money. I immediately booted up my laptop, shifting into a deeply focused, methodical state of mind as I began digging through archived public registries. For hours, I meticulously cross-referenced official corporate filings with the private records my grandfather had secretly preserved over the decades, color-coding every single anomaly I uncovered. The emerging truth wasn't cleverly hidden away, it was sitting out in the open, waiting for someone who wasn't blinded by greed to actually look at the data. I discovered a repeating sequence of rounded financial transfers, all strategically kept just beneath the legal reporting threshold, flowing directly into a shell company my father managed. It was the definitive, cold confirmation of the quiet corruption that had been whispering through our family dynamics for my entire life. As twilight began to fall over the ridge, I packed my analytical notes and took out the second item from the envelope, which was a small brass key. I knew instantly that it belonged to the heavy locked cabinet beneath Arthur's desk, a compartment he had always touched right before leaving his private study. I drove back to the lake house under the cover of darkness, slipping past my parents' neatly parked cars and entering the dim hallway without making a sound. From the living room, I could hear their forced, uneasy laughter as they greedily debated their upcoming investment strategies and future inheritance payouts. I stepped into the quiet study, smelling the familiar scent of old books as I knelt down and turned the brass key in the metal lock. The cabinet clicked open smoothly, revealing organized binders, years of printed emails, a small digital recording device, and another letter addressed directly to me. As I flipped through the pages, I found undeniable proof that my parents had systematically stripped my grandfather of his corporate voting control through highly deceptive legal advice. I quickly uploaded digital copies of every single page into a secure cloud drive, backing them up multiple times to ensure the evidence could never be destroyed. Before leaving the room, I noticed a tiny camera lens expertly concealed within the dark wooden molding of the bookshelf, realizing my grandfather had recorded everything that transpired in his final months. Arthur had always believed that truth was an administrative tool, and he had custom-built a system to ensure that justice would eventually execute itself through my hands. As I crept back toward the exit, I heard my mother's voice carry down the hallway, confidently telling my father that I lacked the intelligence to understand complex financial matters. I simply smiled in the dark, knowing that the very walls were finally listening to her arrogance. The following morning, the brilliant winter sun cast long, cold shadows across the floorboards as my parents and sister gathered in the main room, dressed far too formally for the hour. A sudden knock interrupted their quiet plotting, and Arthur's lifelong attorney and closest friend, Mr. Vance, stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase and a media player. My mother's polished smile instantly faltered as the attorney ignored her greeting, calmly placed the device on the table, and pressed the play button. The room suddenly filled with the unmistakable, resonant voice of my grandfather, stating that if this tape was playing, his strict conditions had been met. The screen flickered to life, displaying hidden camera footage of my parents frantically tearing through Arthur's private desk the previous afternoon, callously debating property values and leverage. My mother instantly stepped forward to claim the footage was completely out of context, but Mr. Vance silently raised his hand to cut her off as the next slide appeared. The monitor began projecting the exact fraudulent tax documents, rounded payments, and forged signatures that I had discovered and organized in my notebook the night before. My father's face drained of color as he weakly blurted out that old paperwork could easily be misinterpreted by the courts. Then, my grandfather's recorded voice returned, speaking directly to me with a tone full of profound affection, telling me that the will reading was merely the beginning of the real reckoning. My mother completely lost her composure, her voice cracking with visible panic as she ordered me to stop the presentation immediately, claiming I didn't understand the family business. I remained entirely motionless and silent as Mr. Vance opened his briefcase, sliding out a set of legally binding directives that had been finalized months prior to Arthur's passing. The attorney calmly announced that while my parents kept their basic properties, the massive remainder of the estate belonged to me. My father furiously stood up, loudly threatening to contest the new documents in court, but Mr. Vance quickly countered that any legal challenge would instantly forfeit all assets to a public foundation. Furthermore, the attorney pointedly reminded my father that the documents contained a specific clause triggering a full criminal review of his past fraudulent advisory work. The entire room went completely dead silent as I stepped forward, softly placing the brass key onto the table like a final verdict. My parents stared at the key in absolute shock, finally realizing that their long campaign of invisibility had utterly failed against the truth. After the legal team and my defeated family finally departed, I stayed behind at the lake house, letting the profound quiet settle back into the wooden walls. I walked out onto the empty dock, looking down at the still water that Arthur had always taught me to listen to so carefully throughout my lonely childhood. The heavy burden of their constant emotional abuse and rejection completely evaporated into the cool morning mist, leaving me entirely whole for the first time in my life. I sat on the edge of the boards, feeling the warm sunlight hit my skin, knowing that this beautiful, unyielding silence finally belonged to me.